Well, before our speaker comes up, who I'm going to introduce right now, the men's chorale is going to continue to help us in our worship this morning. But Kate Wiebe is someone I've been wanting to have come to the chapel for a long time. She's doing something that is so utterly unique and yet ought not to be, because it's so needed. And I'm not going to say any more than that. I'm going to let Kate tell you why it's so needed. You're going to agree. And you're going to be fascinated by how needed this is. You'll know when she comes up. But Kate is, you're so welcome here at Westmont. Kate moved here just a few years back with her husband, Eric. They're both graduated from Gordon College. She got her PhD at Garrett Theological Seminary. And they have 3 kids, and her family, her extended family, are some of the dearest people in my life. But that's not why she's here. She's here because you really want to hear what she has to talk about. So, Kate, we'll just have you come on up after we hear from the men's chorale.
Thank you. Good morning, Westmont. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Ben, for the invitation. I am grateful to be here with you all today and grateful to get to share with you some of my passion for clergy and congregational health, especially after crises. I'm the founder and director of the Institute for Congregational Trauma and Growth. And that is a network organization. We have a website, and there's a lot of tools on there for ministers that are all provided free, films and podcasts. And we also provide in-person forums, and we promote scholarship in these areas of congregational trauma and growth. I also am a consultant in the area for the Presbyterian of Santa Barbara and also some other local denominations when there have been crises in the last couple of years. And then the third hat I wear professionally is I volunteer for Presbyterian disaster assistance. And for that, I get deployed along with a team to congregations and to communities that have had a disaster. In the last 5 years, I have responded to tornadoes in Alabama and Texas. I've also responded to Tucson, Aurora, and Newtown, to the shootings that happened there. Most recently in Newtown, I was the lead for our denomination and the team that responded there. Why and how did I get into this ministry? That was something that Ben asked me and hoped that I would share with you all today, so that's what we're going to focus on. To begin, I would like to show you through a short visual aid, if you would indulge me. I'm going to list some topics, and I would like to ask you to stand if you are familiar with them. Once you stand, please remain standing. So please stand if you know someone, and they may or may not still be alive, but if you know someone, a friend, a relative, who has ever fought in a war. Please stand if you know someone who has survived a shooting. Please stand if you know someone who is a survivor of sexual misconduct, molestation, or rape. Please stand if you know someone who has ever lost a loved one due to sudden death. Please stand if you know someone who has ever lost a baby or a child. Please stand if you know someone who has ever lost a home because of a natural storm, flooding, earthquake, wildfire. And please stand if you know someone who could tell you right now exactly where they were when Kennedy died, when the Challenger exploded, or when the planes hit the Twin Towers. Trauma is all around us, and it affects me. Before you sit, indulge me in one more activity. Put your hands out and clench them as tight as you can, and release. and stretch your neck to one side and the other. Roll your shoulders and take a big, deep, slow breath. Please be seated. Seeing the affects of trauma all around me and some of the ways that the affects of trauma pass through generations, and believing that as a Christian I am called to respond, has led me into this ministry of practicing and advocating for clergy and congregational health after crises. I believe that responding to trauma well leads to transformation and thriving in the church. One of the many biblical texts that inform my sense of calling is the story of the Good Samaritan. Jesus asks, who was a good neighbor in this story? And the answer is the one who draws near, is moved, and responds to the trauma that is in his path. That is being a good neighbor. And that is my life work, specifically responding to the impacts of trauma for clergy and congregations. As we just saw, even among just us, trauma is all around us. According to the 2011-2012 National Survey of Children's Health, almost half of the children, almost 50% of the children in the United States today will suffer 1, 2, or more traumatic experiences before they turn 18. According to the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Alliance, a multidisciplinary group, an estimated 70% of adults in the United States today have experienced a traumatic event at least once in their lives, and 20% of those people will have PTSD. Experts say that we have entered a new territory in the impacts of natural disasters where storms are no longer seasonal and they are no longer specifically geographic. Between 2009 and 2013, the United States experienced 93 mass shootings, an average of 2 per month in 35 states. And these statistics don't even begin to look at the impacts of internal leadership conflicts in congregations, chronic stress environments, or cases of sexual misconduct that affect every faith group across socio and economic lines. A lot has been said lately about declining church memberships. I cannot help but wonder about the correlation between traumas and rising and falling membership. Yet no one has studied this factor to date in any extensive way, which surprises me. So no one knows, how does sexual misconduct affect membership? How does a pastor's death affect membership? How does severe financial embezzlement affect membership? I am concerned about the trauma factor and how it correlates with church membership because I wonder to what extent people experience congregations to be locations for healing and restoration. To what extent are they sanctuaries and places of worship and transformation after wounding? I am concerned about these things partly because of my own experiences with healing and nurture in congregations, as well as wounding there. A number of years ago, I was working as a director of congregational care at a church in the Midwest, and we experienced a shooting, a double murder-suicide on church grounds. I had just returned from maternity leave with our third child. The deaths included our church secretary, the woman with the candy jar. Among many things, I remember realizing on that first day that it was her voice on the church answering machine, and the phone was ringing constantly. I changed the message, and for the first week behind my voice, you could hear the slow, steady snoring of the 3-month-old that I was holding in my arms. Life does not stop just because a trauma has occurred, as much as we wish it sometimes would. In the aftermath of that incident, I sought out a counseling supervisor. My counseling load had increased significantly in the weeks and months that followed, as people in the congregation began to relive former personal tragedies and community crises from the past. My supervisor was very good, partly because of what he could draw on from his own experience. At one point, he had been called in as the pastoral care consultant for a church that experienced a very complicated event. An associate minister murdered the senior minister and covered the crime up with arson, and then showed up the next morning to provide pastoral care for the congregation. I wish I could say that events like that did not exist. It's heartbreaking to know that they do. Many people have wondered if the shooting event I just told you about was the event that led me into this ministry. Sadly, it is not. Long before that event, I was well aware of the tragedies that can wreak havoc on a congregation. By that time in my graduate work, I was already shaping my interests in the interfaces of trauma, congregations, and church leadership. Some events that led me into this ministry include a sexual molestation case in my home church that resulted in a pastor being defrocked and imprisoned, several pastoral marriages that ended in divorce, a church split after a pastor and a counselee had had an affair, and a pastor being dismissed from his position after using the church computer for his addiction to pornography. Then, in the first semester of graduate school, Eric and I moved into Princeton Seminary on the evening of September 10th, 2001. September 11th is a tremendous way to get to know your seminary neighbors. Our building consisted of 8 apartments. In one, a spouse of a student was an elementary school teacher in the neighboring town. That day, she was given flyers to hand out that said, "If you get off the bus today and no one comes home, call this number." We found out later that one of the girls did have to call. 3 months later, in December, for several reasons, my home church, at that time a 10-year-old new church development, officially dissolved, leaving me church homeless in my first year of seminary. Some people ask, after all these experiences, why are you still in the church? Because as much as I am familiar with the heartache of congregational life, I am also deeply familiar and draw on the good and restorative parts of congregations. I grew up in a thriving congregation filled with adults who were passionate about sharing their faith with my peers and I. I remember learning Bible stories in Sunday school from Sunday school teachers who enjoyed sharing them, singing in the children's choir, participating in church school plays, and perhaps especially being taught that my prayers as a child mattered. I had my first prayer partner in 2nd grade and my first prayer lock-in in 6th grade, and it was a lot more fun than that might sound. I was a part of small groups, fellowship, and mission work all through adolescence. I've seen the church be a source of healing and growth, and I know that it can become that after disaster and trauma. I also know that leadership betrayal does not define my faith practice. And it does not equate for me whether a church is a good thing or not. What it does show me is that leadership in any institution is human, and it will have problems along the way. In this world, we will have trouble. But take heart, Jesus has overcome. I passionately believe Jesus when he says that a time is coming where we will worship in spirit and in truth. And I know that it is in that amazing commingling of the Holy Spirit, truth, and showing up that we become new creations. I also know that I was not the only one that witnessed all of the events that I mentioned. Hundreds of people witnessed them and were affected by them. But it's taking time as a culture for us to learn how to acknowledge together what has happened. We are not practiced in following the prophet Joel when he says, "Gather the assembly of all ages to share what it is that has happened." And I get it. We've been protecting ourselves, and we are conditioned to do so. Conditioned by ourselves and others who just want normal after a disaster. Conditioned by our self-made culture that insists that the best families are the ones with no problems. And conditioned by collective beliefs that the best ways to deal with trauma are to be cool, move on, and just focus on the positive. The problem is, and what studies are showing, is that the longer you hold the affects, the emotional and biological residue of trauma at arm's length, the longer it stays with you. They wreak havoc on our bodies, our relationships, our families, and our organizations. Our organizations and our families actually get shaped around the emotional residue of trauma. Our bodies, both persons and groups, do not do well when we are saturated with adrenaline and cortisol for long periods of time, which is a part of that emotional residue. We have to grow in our abilities to metabolize this post-trauma energy in order to promote thriving in ourselves, our families, our organizations, and our communities. There are 3 keys to metabolizing post-trauma energy well. And this is the central focus of my ministry work, how these keys get practically worked out in congregations and with their leaders. The 3 keys are calming amid life storms, which I mentioned earlier, relationships or fellowship, and expressing the affects of trauma with a trustworthy, emotionally safe companion. First, calming and self-regulating. When we feel threatened, we get flooded by what's commonly referred to as fight or flight responses. These are the hormones that help us fight, flee, or, if all else fails, to freeze. Our bodies are created with this great response mechanism that is very helpful in these rare incidences. They are not bad reactions. We want them to happen. We want to have that aggressive ability to respond when it's needed. Interestingly, these are the same hormones that we use to play. So learning how to play well as a child and being involved in sports can actually teach our bodies how to metabolize this energy in healthy ways. And learning how to calm ourselves in the presence of a storm is also critical to moving through these shifts well. A great example of the kind of calming that in the midst of a storm that I'm talking about came when Captain Sullenberg landed his commercial aircraft in the Hudson River a few years ago. In an interview afterwards, he explained that he was able to focus because when his body had an intense physical reaction to the threat of losing both engines shortly after takeoff, he says that he forced calm on the situation. We don't usually hear those two words together, force and calm. But that is essentially what is needed. You counter your internal reaction in order to remain present and to draw on your skills. Second, relationships and fellowship. Studies have shown that when people are members of communities where they experience a sense of belonging and they participate in community activities, they are able to more easily move through the affects of trauma. So churches, schools, clubs, friendships, Bible studies, small groups, all of these can provide the kind of nurture and care that creates and sustains health. Third, expressing the affects of trauma with a trustworthy and emotionally safe companion. This may come in a form of talk therapy. That's what a lot of us think of as going to counseling. But it doesn't have to be. It can be nonverbal as well. It may be done with a pastor or a therapist, or it may be done with a prayer partner, a friend, or a spouse. The critical component here is the mixture of expressing how you are affected while being seen and acknowledged by someone who cares. This is a critical form of care that we very easily walk past in attempts to fix problems. It is much more subtle than we are usually comfortable with, but it is so important. This form of care creates an internal biological shift in the person who is traumatized and begins internal healing processes. It is really a miracle. It counters fight or flight hormones and brings a sense of peace. It does not fix the situation or change the situation in any way, but it creates an ability to respond and to live through the situation. One of my favorite biblical examples of this is when Jesus meets the woman at the well, which is actually the lectionary text for this Sunday. How she experiences transformation by being seen and having her story acknowledged with a safe and trustworthy companion, and then is able to return to her community. Congregations have the capacity to house these three essential keys that traumatologists are saying are most important for healing. Many congregations already do, and most can do it in more informed and intentional ways. Traumatologists, disaster relief leaders, and faith leaders alike are in agreement that we are facing significant challenges today. Our congregations are filled with people who have personally experienced traumas, as we just saw. And our congregations themselves endure internal conflicts and internal traumas, and our communities all throughout the country endure community-wide traumas. As Christians and as faith leaders, we have opportunities to more clearly identify the needs all around us and to create sanctuaries where our neighbors and we can regularly drink living water and be refreshed, that we can be restored and able to draw near, be moved, and to respond well. To end, I just want to say that, as Ben said, I am here, I'm local, and there is so much that we could talk about. There's so much we could have talked about today, and I wanted to give you a brief introduction into the kind of work that I do. If you are interested in this kind of ministry, or if things have come up for you today that you just want to talk through, please feel free to contact me anytime. I would love to get together. And again, thank you for the opportunity to give you a window into some of this work.